I was mid-swing with a hammer fixing my old fence when a woman I'd never seen before stomped up my ridge and heels, pointed at my oak tree, and shouted that I was in violation of her HOA's tree height ordinance. I thought it was a joke until she started snapping photos and muttering about fines like she was auditioning for a villain role in a sitcom. The only problem was this wasn't her land. It wasn't her HOA's land. It was mine, all 60 acres of it, and the entire ridge she was now trespassing on. That was my first real-life encounter with Karen Dunstable, the newly self-appointed enforcer of the Crescent Heights Homeowners Association. I'd heard rumors at the feed store about the neighborhood women who'd taken it upon themselves to regulate everything from porch lights to backyard bird feeders, but I never imagined one would hike halfway up a ridge in wedge sandals just to scream about tree branches and community standards. The wind was picking up, pushing the scent of cut cedar across the ridge as I leaned on my post-hole digger and watched her huff and puff through weeds and rocks, dragging a laminated binder behind her like a sword. "Are you lost?" I asked. "No," she said. "I'm performing my duty as HOA secretary to ensure view obstructions are removed from Crescent Heights." I stared at her for a moment, then pointed to the ground beneath her shoes. "This is private farmland," I said. "I'm not part of your HOA. I own the whole ridge, top to bottom." She blinked. Then she scoffed and said that didn't matter. She said that I still shared the same visual plane as the homeowners below and that I'd be receiving a notice in the mail. Before I could respond, she turned, nearly twisted her ankle on a root, and stumbled back down the trail, muttering about bylaws and landscaping citations. I figured that would be the end of it. I've lived here my whole life, inherited the land from my grandfather, who carved out the original trail with nothing but a mule and a will. Our property line had been surveyed, notarized, and burned into the county registry longer than Crescent Heights had even existed. It was farmland, not suburbia. But by the time the week was over, I realized Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 2 days later, a drone hovered over my goat pen, startling the herd and causing one of the kids to run straight into a feed trough. The drone was dragging a banner that said, "Remove ridge view obstructions." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or grab my shotgun, but I chose the middle ground and took a photo instead. When I followed the drone's flight path, I saw it dip down toward the Crescent Heights cul-de-sac before disappearing behind a row of pristine houses with identical mailboxes. The next morning, a folded envelope appeared inside my gate, hand-delivered and printed with HOA letterhead. Inside was a notice stating that my ridge trees were causing sunlight imbalance and seasonal shading effects on units 17 through 21. It was signed Karen Dunstable, HOA Secretary. I looked at the bottom of the form. There was a fine listed, $500 due in 15 days. Now I wasn't just annoyed. I was amused because I knew something Karen didn't. Not only was I not part of her HOA, not only did I legally own the entire ridge, but I also had water rights, air rights, and conservation easement protections going back over 40 years. I was grandfathered into an entirely different set of county rules, and her clipboard fantasies didn't apply to a single blade of grass on my land. But I wanted to handle it calmly. I drove down to the Crescent Heights HOA office, which turned out to be a shed-sized trailer parked beside their community pool. The receptionist was 20 years younger than me and had the nervous look of someone who regretted accepting a job that involved dealing with neighborhood dictators. I asked to speak with Karen. She was in a closed-door meeting. I waited. 45 minutes later, she emerged in a pantsuit and flip-flops, visibly startled to see me standing in the hallway. I handed her back the notice. I told her again, politely, that I was not in her HOA and that any future attempts to regulate my land would be treated as harassment. She smiled in that thin, smug way people do when they think they're still in control. She said she had legal advice that said otherwise. I asked her to provide it in writing. She nodded and walked away. I expected that to be the end of the circus. But that very night, someone spray-painted community property in bright orange on the wooden arch I had built years ago at the top of the Ridge Trail. My arch. My trail. The next morning I found pamphlets stuffed into my mailbox advertising a shared parkland vision for the upper ridge. It included walking paths, benches, and a community garden plot. Karen was listed as project coordinator. The gloves were off. I went down to the barn and grabbed my chainsaw. I cleared the trail entirely, cut off the access slope with thorn brush, and posted 3 fresh signs made from cedar planks right at the edge of the HOA boundary. Each sign was burned with the same words: private farmland, no HOA authority, keep out. Then I rewired my solar cameras and aimed them down the trail. If they wanted to keep playing games, I'd play too. That night I sat on my porch, drinking coffee as the sun went down, listening to the coyotes in the distance and the rustling of goats settling into their straw. And I smiled, because what Karen didn't realize yet, what she would soon come to understand, was that I wasn't just some retiree with a barn full of bees and goats. I was the wrong man to pick a land war with. And the ridge? That was just the beginning. 3 days after I put up the cedar signs, the first so-called survey crew showed up. I spotted them just past dawn. 3 strangers with neon vests and tripods poking around my upper fence line like they had every right to be there. One of them was standing on top of a rock near the goat enclosure, pointing some kind of laser tool toward Crescent Heights below. Another was scribbling notes on a clipboard, while the third, who looked barely old enough to rent a car, was unfolding a large paper map that flapped wildly in the breeze. None of them looked like official county workers. I grabbed my thermos, whistled for Buck, my border collie, and walked out to greet them. The moment they saw me, they tried to look busy. One of them stepped forward and introduced himself as Mark. He said they were with a firm called Sideline Management, contracted by the Crescent Heights Homeowners Association to assess boundary integrity and shared elevation use. I asked him, very calmly, if he understood that this land was privately owned and not part of any shared elevation. He fumbled, looked at the others, then said they were told it was pending HOA acquisition. That's when I saw it. One of the pages on their clipboard had a logo I recognized, Karen's fake HOA letterhead again. I didn't raise my voice. I just pointed down the trail and said they had 10 minutes to vacate the property before I called the sheriff. One of them asked if they could finish measuring just the eastern slope. I said no. They packed up faster than I expected and hustled down the ridge, with Buck herding them like lost sheep the whole way. As I watched them go, I could only wonder how many lies Karen had told to make this happen. That evening, I walked back up to the trail and replaced the old cedar signs with something a little more assertive. I carved them myself and mounted them on fresh posts, each with a border of coiled wire to keep curious fingers away. The top plank read Private Farmland. The one beneath it said, Enter at your own risk. The third, hand-painted in bright red, Mad Goat Crossing. I didn't expect it to stop Karen, but I figured it might slow her down. By the next morning, a new post had appeared at the bottom of the ridge, planted right beside the Crescent Heights walking path. It was made of cheap pine, nailed crookedly into the dirt, and had a sign stapled to it that read, Future Community Nature Trail Opening Soon. I stood there staring at it for a full minute, blinking like maybe I was seeing things. I wasn't. There were pink survey flags dotting the hillside, leading toward my land. Someone had even sprayed directional arrows onto a few rocks. It was bold. It was illegal. And it was Karen, no doubt in my mind. That afternoon, I made a trip into town. I stopped by the sheriff's office and filed an official complaint for trespassing and unauthorized surveying. Then I drove over to the county clerk and requested another certified copy of my land deed, which included all 59 acres plus the elevation rights across the upper ridge. On the way home, I stopped by the lumber yard and picked up some new supplies. By sunset, I had something special ready. Just beyond the goat pasture, I built a tall gate. Nothing fancy, just 2 cedar posts and a crossbeam with a swinging gate that latched from my side. Over the arch, I burned a fresh message with my wood burner. Ridge access by permit only. Beneath that, I hung a wooden plaque that read, Entry fee, 1 bucket of goat manure. Beside it, I placed an old donation box and attached a motion sensor camera angled perfectly toward the trail entrance. I didn't care if it looked ridiculous. In fact, I wanted it to. Karen needed to know she wasn't playing with amateurs. 2 mornings later, I caught her red-handed. My camera sent me a notification around 10:30. When I opened the footage, there she was, marching up the trail in a pink windbreaker and oversized sunglasses, dragging 2 confused HOA members behind her like they were part of a tour group. She stopped in front of the gate, pointed at the sign, and started waving her arms wildly. Then she reached for the latch, only to trigger the goat bell I'd wired to the hinge. It clanged once, loud and sharp, and startled everyone, including Buck, who came sprinting from the side pasture, barking his head off. Karen shrieked and took 2 steps back, tripping over a root and landing square in a pile of compost I'd spread earlier that week for the pumpkin patch. The 2 HOA members helped her up, but not before one of them burst out laughing. She slapped his arm and stormed off down the trail, shoes coated in mulch and pride wounded beyond repair. I saved that footage, of course. Might even use it in a future Ridge Day presentation. Later that week, I got a call from the sheriff's office. They'd received a complaint from Karen, accusing me of obstructing community access and endangering hikers with aggressive livestock. The deputy who called me was chuckling the whole time. He said he watched the footage and assured me there was no legal issue. In fact, he suggested I post it online as a public service announcement. I thanked him and told him I had bigger plans for it. I spent the next few days quietly reinforcing the toll gate and adding a few more surprises along the trail. Nothing harmful, just a few strategically placed scarecrows dressed like county inspectors and a decoy camera with a blinking red light. I even installed a motion-activated speaker that played goat bleats and rooster crows when someone got too close. It was harmless fun, but it sent a clear message. This was private land, and I wasn't going to sit back while some clipboard tyrant tried to claim it as her weekend playground. Despite all this, Karen wasn't done. She started printing flyers that she left in mailboxes around Crescent Heights, claiming that the upper ridge had been misclassified and was in review for public designation. She even held a meeting at the clubhouse where she claimed to have new satellite imagery proving that the Ridge Plateau fell within the HOA's aesthetic zoning boundary. I had to read that one twice just to make sense of it, but something was changing. A few of the HOA residents started reaching out to me directly. One man named Carl sent me a message asking if it was true that I owned the entire ridge and had no obligation to the HOA. I sent him a photo of my deed, highlighted in yellow, and the toll gate in the background. His reply was just 3 words. That explains everything. I could feel the shift coming. Karen had overplayed her hand. What started as a nuisance was turning into a crusade, but she hadn't realized yet that this crusade was built on a lie. And the more she pushed, the harder the truth would push back. It started with a folded flyer taped to my mailbox. It had a sketch of my ridge, drawn with dotted lines, walking trails looping around trees that had never been trimmed, and picnic tables I'd certainly never installed. At the top in bold black font, it said, "Community Ridge Park coming soon." There were smiling cartoon people hiking and walking dogs, and a banner strung between trees that read, "HOA Cares." I turned it over and found an RSVP for a groundbreaking ceremony. I stared at it for a good minute before setting it down on the porch railing and letting out a slow laugh. Karen was not just trespassing anymore. She was now advertising. Later that morning, I drove down to the Crescent Heights clubhouse, flyer in hand. The clubhouse was decorated with pastel-colored balloons and folding chairs arranged in rows. A banner hung near the refreshment table that read, "Celebrating Our Shared Natural Beauty." Karen stood at the front with a microphone and a clipboard, gesturing toward an easel-mounted map that showed my ridge carved into recreational zones. As I entered the room, a few heads turned. Karen caught sight of me and froze for half a second before her smile widened unnaturally. She called me up to say a few words as a neighboring landholder. I walked slowly, calmly, and stood beside her. Then I held the flyer up and asked her who gave permission to plan this park on private land. The room fell silent. She tried to dance around it. She said she was in discussions with county officials about long-term community benefit zones and recreational use corridors. It was nonsense, all of it. HOA residents began whispering. One woman raised her hand and asked if the HOA had actually bought the ridge. Karen said negotiations were underway. That was her fatal mistake. I pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to the nearest HOA member. Inside was a copy of my deed with my name, the county seal, and the boundaries clearly marked. It showed in no uncertain terms that the land everyone was sitting around talking about didn't belong to the HOA or any county partnership. It belonged to me. The room buzzed. Karen tried to salvage the moment by saying I had misunderstood her intentions, that she was only advocating for visual access, not physical control. But the flyer told a different story. The map on the easel behind her had my barn labeled as Trail Center. I turned and asked her if she had plans to turn my goats into tour guides next. A few people chuckled. Karen's face flushed. I thanked everyone and walked out, leaving her standing alone with her binder and her unraveling lies. The next morning, I found someone had moved one of the trail signs I had posted at the border of my property. It now pointed downward toward the HOA walking trail, as if my private land was just another loop in their weekend hiking schedule. I fixed the sign and added a second post beneath it that read, "Unauthorized use will result in manure redistribution." Just for fun, I attached a bucket of goat pellets beside it with a scoop labeled HOA Snack Time. I thought that might slow her down. It didn't. 2 days later, I spotted a small group hiking up the ridge with bottled water and backpacks. Karen was leading them, pointing at trees and pretending she was some kind of nature guide. I waited by the gate. When they got close enough, I stepped out from behind a tree with Buck at my side. Karen startled and told the others to stay calm. She introduced me as the park ranger, as if we had rehearsed this little performance. I didn't speak. I simply opened the gate, stepped through, and locked it behind me. One man asked Karen why there was a lock if the park was open. Another asked about the goat sign. She laughed nervously and claimed I was just being eccentric, and that some private land elements were still in transition. Then I pulled out my phone and started recording. I asked each of them if they had permission to be on my land. A few shook their heads. One said he thought this was a public ridge. Karen tried to stop me from filming, saying I needed HOA consent to distribute footage. I told her the only thing I needed was my own battery charger. The group turned around and walked back down the trail. That evening, I sent the video to the sheriff and the county zoning office with a brief explanation. I also printed a few still shots and tacked them to my barn door beneath the heading, "Today's Field Trip." My neighbors, who'd once seemed amused by the whole affair, were now starting to see how serious it had become. It wasn't just about goats and views anymore. Karen was actively trying to steal public perception and repurpose it into fake ownership. I knew what had to come next. I called my attorney, a sharp old friend named Jason who used to argue land rights cases in the state capitol before retiring to our quiet town. Jason listened to everything, then asked if I had documentation of each incident. I told him I had video, photos, witness names, and every fraudulent flyer she printed. He said it was enough to move forward with cease and desist orders and a potential civil complaint. I wasn't looking to sue anyone. Not yet. I just wanted her to stop, to leave my ridge alone. In the meantime, I took matters into my own hands. I called a few buddies who worked in construction and had them deliver some old fencing and landscape barriers. Over the next 2 days, I restructured the main trail so that it ended in a circular goat pen. Anyone who wandered up would find themselves surrounded by bleeding goats with no clear path forward. I added a few mirrors to confuse the more adventurous ones and even installed a speaker that played barnyard sounds at random intervals. It was harmless mischief, but it gave me peace of mind. By the end of the week, Crescent Heights residents were starting to talk openly. One man named Greg showed up at my gate with a cooler full of soda and said he was sorry about all the trouble. He said his wife had gone to one of Karen's planning meetings and left more confused than informed. Another neighbor emailed me a photo of a flyer she found at the community center that had a map of the ridge with trails labeled Secret Spring and Sunset Path. She said it looked like something printed for a vacation resort. I thanked her and added it to my file. Karen hadn't shown her face in 2 days, but I knew she was watching. She wasn't the type to quit easily, but the story was starting to slip from her hands. The harder she tried to claim my land, the more the truth pushed back. It wasn't just me anymore. It was the neighbors, the county, the evidence. And every time she printed a new flyer or hiked up with her clipboard, I was ready with my camera, my signs, and my goats. Because one way or another, this ridge was going to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. The ridge had gone quiet for almost a week. No flyers, no hikers, no Karen. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized the battle was over. The new signs had stayed untouched. The goat pen diversion had done its job. Even the scarecrow I dressed in a county inspector jacket remained undisturbed. But I should have known better. Karen never disappeared for long. She was the kind of storm that goes quiet before it comes back twice as loud. It started with an engine. A loud, rumbling engine echoing through the trees just after sunrise. At first, I thought one of the neighbors might be clearing brush or hauling gravel. But when I stepped onto the porch and looked up the slope, I saw a small bulldozer crawling up the access trail toward the ridge line. Behind it were two men in reflective vests and hard hats. And behind them, walking with arms crossed and lips pursed, was Karen. I walked out to meet them, coffee mug still in hand. The bulldozer was making slow work of the trail, pushing rocks aside and flattening shrubs as it went. The lead worker saw me and waved as if this were a scheduled delivery. I asked him who authorized the work. He said they were there to clear a community trailhead and install support beams for a future picnic overlook. My name wasn't on any paperwork, but they were told this was HOA maintained land. I asked him who gave that information. He nodded toward Karen, who stood behind the machine with a stack of folders. She stepped forward, wearing sunglasses and holding a thick binder like it was a badge. She claimed that HOA had received verbal assurance from a county zoning committee that a temporary trail adjustment could be made under recreational variance protocols. She used the kind of language that sounds official when you say it fast enough, but I wasn't buying it. I told the bulldozer operator to kill the engine, which he did. Then I pulled out my phone and started recording. Karen immediately stepped back, saying she would only speak with proper legal representation present. I nodded and called the sheriff. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later, driving his familiar white truck with the mud-splattered sides. Sheriff Thomas stepped out, shaking his head before I even finished explaining the situation. He walked over to Karen and asked her if she had any legal documentation that gave her the right to operate machinery on private property. She pulled out a stack of printed emails, none of which were signed by any official or department. One looked like a forwarded newsletter. Another was a list of suggestions from an HOA brainstorming session. Thomas didn't even finish reading them. He turned to the crew and told them to pack up their equipment and leave immediately. They didn't argue. Karen protested, of course. She said I was obstructing a community beautification effort. She said my land was a critical shared view corridor, and that my refusal to cooperate bordered on environmental negligence. Thomas listened politely, then handed her a printed map with my property boundaries highlighted in red. He said if she crossed that line again with tools, machines, or survey teams, she could be charged with criminal trespassing. Karen's jaw tightened, and she mumbled something about legal action. The sheriff didn't flinch. He said if she wanted to sue me, she was welcome to try, but until then, stay off the ridge. After they left, I spent the rest of the day walking the trail, checking for damage. The bulldozer had torn up a few wildflower patches and flattened part of my pumpkin starter bed. Nothing permanent, but enough to make me furious. I took photos, filed them in my growing evidence folder, and decided it was time to go one step further. I wasn't just going to defend the ridge anymore. I was going to draw a line Karen couldn't ignore. The next morning, I hired a local carpenter named Ellis to help me build a new structure near the top of the ridge. We worked for 3 straight days, hauling wood, leveling beams, and installing panels. By the time we were done, there was a 6-foot-tall wooden archway straddling the trail. Across the top, we burned in the words, "Ridge Preserve, entrance by private invitation only." On either side, we posted laminated documents that included copies of my deed, zoning declarations, and 2 signed letters from the sheriff confirming my exclusive rights. I also added a camera tower nearby, camouflaged with cedar branches, and a motion-activated speaker that played the sound of bleating goats, followed by a recorded message stating, "This is private farmland. HOA access is not authorized. Turn back now." It was theatrical, I admit, but by then I was done playing nice. 2 days later, Karen returned, not with workers or flyers this time, but with a photographer and a man in a sport coat who introduced himself as a real estate consultant. They claimed they were documenting natural features for a promotional HOA brochure. I stepped out of the barn and reminded them, once again, that they were standing on private land. Karen argued the trail had become a de facto community path due to public use. I asked her how many people had been chased off that trail by my goats in the last month. She didn't answer. Then she made her final mistake. She stepped under the arch, past the laminated signs, and into the goat pasture. Within seconds, 3 of my youngest goats were sprinting toward her, tails flicking and hooves pounding. Karen yelped and ran, the photographer stumbling behind her. The man in the sport coat tried to wave them away, only to be head-butted by a particularly stubborn nanny goat named Penny. They all retreated back down the hill, covered in hay and goat drool. That night, I received a text from a neighbor. It was a photo taken from the clubhouse window. Karen was holding an ice pack to her knee while pointing at a laptop screen and yelling at what looked like an HOA presentation board. The caption read, "Gus, the park opening is delayed." I knew then that the worst of it was probably over. The sheriff had spoken. The signs were up. The goats had delivered their message loud and clear. But I also knew Karen well enough to expect one last act. She wasn't the kind to disappear quietly. She either rally the board, or fake a zoning appeal, or print a whole new set of documents claiming visual domain rights. Whatever it was, I'd be ready. I made a final pass along the ridge that evening, the sun casting long shadows across the pasture. The wind smelled like pine and fresh soil. Buck trotted beside me, ears twitching. The ridge was mine, always had been, but now it wasn't just a piece of land. It was a boundary, a battle line. And Karen, with all her binders and banners, had run smack into it. I had the footage, the papers, the support, and the goats. And next time she tried anything, I'd have a few surprises waiting just beyond the trail. The calm that followed was almost suspicious. For the first time in weeks, I didn't hear any distant drone humming over the ridge. No new flyers showed up in mailboxes. No clipboard-toting invaders wandered up my trails with questions about shade compliance or walking path curvature. Even the goats seemed to sense the stillness. It would have been a relief if I didn't know better. When it comes to people like Karen, silence isn't surrender. It is preparation. That uneasy peace lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, I woke to find something taped to my barn door. It was a thick packet wrapped in a plastic sheet protector, labeled with bright pink tape. Inside were 20 printed pages marked HOA Legal Advisory, with Karen's name signed at the bottom. The top page had a bold statement claiming my ridge was now under investigation for misclassification of terrain use, and that the HOA had submitted documentation to the county to propose emergency designation as a community view resource. I read it twice. It made as much legal sense as a bucket of goat feed, but it was loud and full of false authority. Karen was taking her fiction to the next level. I brought the documents inside and laid them out across the kitchen table. Most of them were printouts of emails between HOA board members discussing their desire to have better access to natural views. A few had maps with lines drawn in pink highlighter. One sheet referenced a website article about land value increase from shared parks. Nowhere was there an official county seal or any actual legal order. It was all noise. But the problem with noise is that if you let it go unanswered, people start to believe it has weight. I called Jason, my attorney, and asked if he was ready to go from observation to action. He said he was more than ready. He had already drafted a cease and desist based on trespassing, defamation, and harassment. After reviewing the latest packet, he added a line about misrepresentation of land ownership with intent to mislead a community body. He told me it was time to hit back on paper before Karen convinced her board to back her with money and made the lie bigger. The next day, I walked into town and hand-delivered copies of the cease and desist to the HOA office, the clubhouse mailbox, and the county zoning department, just to be thorough. Jason also emailed a digital copy to the HOA board with a time-stamped record. The document made everything crystal clear. My land was privately owned. I was not under any HOA. Any attempt to organize use, imply authority, or spread false statements about shared control would be considered a violation of my property rights. If it continued, I would pursue damages in court. I expected it to rattle a few cages. I did not expect what came next. That evening, I received a visit from a man named Dennis, who introduced himself as the vice president of the HOA board. He looked tired, like a man who had been listening to Karen for too long and finally started questioning the story. He asked to sit for a moment on my porch. I offered him a chair and a cold drink. He said he came to apologize. He admitted that most of the board had trusted Karen because she always came armed with binders, bold claims, and a certain aggressive confidence. She called herself efficient. The rest of them were just trying to manage fences and pool hours. He said that after my letter arrived, the board finally looked into Karen's legal sources and found they were just articles and suggestions she had printed off community forums. He said she told them she had permission from the county, but no one had ever confirmed it, until now. I thanked Dennis for coming by and told him I appreciated the honesty. Then I asked him what he planned to do next. He said there was going to be an emergency board meeting. Karen would have to explain herself publicly. I nodded and said I hoped, for his sake and everyone else's, that she came prepared with something real this time, because I was done playing nice. And if she pushed one step further, she would find herself in court, answering for every lie she had mailed, printed, and yelled up my ridge. The emergency meeting was held at the clubhouse 2 nights later. I didn't attend, but I had friends who did. One of them sent me a video clip of Karen standing at the front of the room, waving a stack of papers and pointing to a projector screen that refused to work. She was trying to explain her ridge inclusion model and the benefits of vertical community alignment. But every time someone asked her for proof of ownership or legal authority, she deflected or redirected. She accused me of being anti-community. She said my goats had been trained to attack. She claimed I had erected surveillance towers to intimidate hikers. Each statement got more ridiculous than the last. Then someone asked her directly if she had ever received written approval from any county office to act on ridge planning. She hesitated, then said, "No, not yet, but I have every reason to believe it would come." That was the breaking point. The board voted right then and there to suspend her indefinitely, pending review. Some residents applauded. A few walked out. My neighbor Carl told me Karen looked like a balloon slowly losing air. The following morning, I received a formal letter of apology signed by 4 board members. It said the HOA would cease all discussion of ridge integration and respect all boundaries permanently. They thanked me for my patience and included a small basket of homemade preserves and fresh bread. I shared it with Jason and Ellis as a thank you for their help. Karen, however, was not finished. She posted one last online rant claiming that I had manipulated local government, faked documents, and brainwashed my goats into becoming a private security force. The post was flagged and taken down within hours, but someone screenshotted it and printed a copy. I pinned it to the inside of my barn, right next to my laminated deed and the photo of Karen being chased downhill by Penny. That night, the ridge was quiet again. No engines, no footsteps, just the soft shuffle of goats bedding down in hay and the hum of summer insects along the trees. I stood on the edge of the trail, lantern in hand, and looked down toward the rows of perfect houses below. Their porch lights blinked in neat little patterns, none of them reaching high enough to touch the land above. The battle for the ridge was over. The line had held, and Karen finally had to live on the other side of it. Summer drifted in fully now, coating the ridge in golden light and the warm, dry scent of pine needles and sun-baked soil. It was the kind of quiet that hummed instead of shouted, a gentle stillness where even the goats seemed to move more slowly. For the first time in what felt like months, I could walk my trails without looking over my shoulder for a drone, a clipboard, or a bulldozer. The signs remained untouched, the tall gate unchallenged, and Karen was nowhere to be seen. Word had spread that she was taking a break from HOA activities, which was polite code for being voted off the island. No flyers, no studded trail tours, no printed maps or view corridor campaigns, just silence. And for me, it was the sweetest sound. But silence alone isn't celebration, and I felt like something bigger was needed. Not a fight, a finish. Something that closed the whole ridiculous chapter with a laugh, not a sigh. So I started planning a little event of my own. Nothing political, nothing confrontational, just a Ridge Day festival. A small gathering of neighbors and friends who had stuck by me, laughed with me, or simply respected my right to defend my land. I figured if Karen could plan fake groundbreaking ceremonies, I could throw one that was real. I called it Ridge Day. The invitations were handwritten on brown recycled cards with sketches of goats in the corners and stamped with ink that said, "No HOA needed." I passed them out at the feed store, the diner, and even slipped a few under fences near Crescent Heights. I didn't expect many to show. Maybe a few curious folks. Maybe Carl and his wife. Maybe Jason if his back was feeling up to it. But on the morning of Ridge Day, as I set out folding chairs and checked the homemade lemonade station, a long line of cars started to roll up the trail. By noon, there were over 40 people milling around the ridge. We had a goat race, which mostly involved Penny wandering off mid-run and everyone laughing. We had a bluegrass trio playing near the tool shed, and folks brought pies and jars of pickled vegetables. Kids rolled down the slope in old potato sacks, while parents took photos near the Tollgate Arch. I even gave a short walking tour, explaining how the land had been in my family since the 1950s and how every tree, stone, and post had a story behind it. There was no sign of Karen, though someone said they spotted her standing behind her fence down below, arms folded, watching through binoculars. I waved once, just in case. She didn't wave back. Toward the end of the day, Jason pulled me aside and said he had brought something for the occasion. From his briefcase, he pulled a framed copy of the cease and desist letter, marked with the date and stamped filed. He said it was my badge of honor now. I thanked him, and together we mounted it inside the barn, just beside the photo of Karen's last retreat. The barn wall was becoming a kind of museum, not out of spite, but out of memory, a way to remind myself that boundaries matter, that standing firm can be done with humor and strength at the same time. As the sun dipped below the trees and shadows stretched long across the pasture, I lit a few lanterns and passed around one last tray of cookies. Carl raised a toast with a mason jar full of iced tea and said something about good fences and better neighbors. People laughed, and someone added that good goats help too. Buck barked once, as if agreeing. The laughter settled into that familiar quiet again, the kind that says everything without needing words. The ridge had been defended, and not just with signs and paperwork. It had been defended with grit and community and the quiet power of telling the truth over and over until it stuck. A few days later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, just a neat label that read Tools. Inside was a single laminated photo. It was a screenshot from one of Karen's deleted posts, the one where she claimed I had trained my goats into a rogue security team. Someone had added bold text at the bottom that read, Patrol Unit 1. I chuckled and pinned it to the barn wall beneath the others. Then I took a walk, alone this time, through the ridge trail that had once been so full of noise. Everything looked as it should. The signs were still standing. The arch was strong. The pasture was green, and the goats were chewing contentedly near the edge. I walked until I reached the far overlook, where the ridge dropped into a gentle slope with a view of Crescent Heights in the distance. Their rooftops all matched, perfect grids of suburban planning. Lights flicked on one by one, small boxes in tidy rows. It was a world with rules and guidelines, meetings and minutes. Down there, people voted on whether your grass was too tall. Up here, the grass grew wild on purpose. As I stood looking over the ridge, a breeze picked up. It carried the scent of sage and cedar and stirred the edge of my shirt like a whisper. It reminded me that peace isn't just the absence of conflict. It's the result of having fought for what matters and knowing you'd do it again if needed. Karen had thrown everything at me. Drones, flyers, fake surveyors, bulldozers, even public meetings. And yet here I stood, still on my land, still at peace. Back at the barn, I closed the doors, checked the gate latches, and whistled for Buck. He trotted to my side, tail wagging. We walked toward the house as dusk rolled in, the sky deepening into purple and orange. I didn't know if Karen would ever try again. People like her rarely changed completely. But I did know that the next time she or anyone else tried to redraw my boundaries, they'd face more than just fences and goats. They'd face a man who had been through the whole ridiculous war and come out stronger, steadier, and funnier than before. Because this ridge wasn't just soil and trees. It was family. It was memory. It was earned. And most of all, it was mine.